We're in Hebrews, the 9th chapter, and we're going to begin studying at verse 18, and hopefully we're going to make it through verse 23 tonight. The Apostle Paul, and I believe the Apostle Paul is the writer. I know there's a lot of debate about that, and it's interesting to me that some individuals are just dead set that it was Apollos. And does anybody know what Origen said about the authorship? Anybody? Origen said this: if it were not the Apostle Paul, then only God knows. And that's about right, okay? God knows exactly who wrote the book. And hopefully we'll find out when we die and go to heaven. We can ask about that, can't we? And we'll know who wrote it. But we're in Hebrews, the 9th chapter. We went through verses 15 through 17, where the apostle had told us that it was necessary for something to happen in order for a testament to come into effect. What was that? The death of the testator. Okay? Now there were two different views on this idea of a testament. Some individuals refer to it as a testament, like a last will and testament, similar to the wills that we make today. And those don't go into effect until what? Until the individual dies. Now, if you go into a study of the word testament in the Greek language, it's really the word covenant. And it was very common in the first century for there to be the death of a testator. What it means there is the death of a sacrifice in order for that covenant to go into effect. And so some believe that that's what's being talked about. But either way, there has to be a what take place before the covenant goes into effect? A death. Okay? So he now moves from that, and he talks about the sealing of the covenant, or the dedicating of the covenant in these next few verses, okay? And that's what we're going to be talking about, the dedication of the testaments. And we'll start in Hebrews 9, verse 18. He talks first about the first testament that was dedicated with blood. Notice what he says. Whereupon neither the first testament was dedicated without blood. Now that's a double what? That's a double negative. Neither without blood. What he's really saying is what? Yes, it was dedicated with blood. Sometimes don't you just wish that's what they'd say? Because reading through a double negative sometimes is confusing, okay? But very simply he's saying the first testament was dedicated with blood. That little word dedicated, notice what it means: to inaugurate. Peter says to initiate, consecrate, dedication. Vine says to initiate, okay? Before a covenant could come into effect, there had to be what applied to it? Blood. Okay, there had to be blood applied to it. The two covenants mentioned in Hebrews 9 are mentioned in 9:15, okay? And guys, right here, he's going to contrast and compare these two covenants, okay? There was something very similar about these two covenants, and there's something very different about these two covenants when it comes to the dedication or the inauguration or the establishment of the covenants. But we'll get into that as we go through the lesson, okay? In order for a covenant to be ratified, blood had to be shed. And that principle was true even of the Old Testament. Okay? It was a what? It was a covenant. Okay? What's a covenant? Okay? It's an agreement between two individuals, and we may mention to the fact that there were two different kinds of covenants that were in the first century. Does anybody remember what kind of covenants there were? There's two different kinds. Nobody remembers. There was a covenant between equals. That would be like me and Mary making a covenant with one another. Okay, two human beings making a covenant with each other. And then there's also a covenant between a superior and an inferior, okay? A diatheke, okay? Dia sounds like deity. That's why you can remember. A diatheke covenant is one between a superior and an inferior. And a syntheke covenant was one between two equals. This particular covenant is what kind of a covenant? Yeah, superior and an inferior. God made His covenant with who? With man, with Israel, did He not? He's the superior. Israel is the what? Inferior. We're going to come back to this idea and say something about it in a few minutes because it's just pretty important. Notice, before the covenant became operative, blood was used to dedicate and consecrate the covenant. Notice point D there. Blood is needed because life is in the blood, folks. Okay? Now just keep that concept in your mind. Somebody turn over to Leviticus 17:11 and just read that for us. Life is where? In the blood. Is that true? Yeah. If I drain your blood from you, then guess what happens? You die. It's just that simple. Life is in the blood. And the blood carries all the essential ingredients and nutrients and vitamins that the body needs in order to sustain life. Okay, so life is where? In the blood. Who's got it? We're going to come back to that thought in a minute too, okay? But I just find it interesting that they had to dedicate, they had to inaugurate the covenant with what? With blood. Folks, when they picked up the Old Covenant tablets, okay, or they picked up the book upon which Moses wrote, guess what they saw? Blood stains that had been splashed upon that covenant. Okay? And it indicated, number one, that the covenant was established, right? Oh yeah, I see the blood. It's established. This is a binding covenant, is it not? And it also meant that the covenant was once and for all. You could no longer add to it, nor could you what? Take from it. Did the Old Covenant have a similar warning about adding to and taking from as does the New Covenant? Yeah. Somebody turn over to Deuteronomy 4 and read verse 2 for just a minute. Deuteronomy 4, verse 2. This isn't in your notes. This is just a little extra. Okay, that's what my grandmother used to say, extra. That's Moses talking, folks. You shall not add to, nor what? Take from. Proverbs 30, verse 6. Add thou not unto His word, lest He reprove thee, and thou be found a liar. Okay? So, adding to or taking from the law of Moses was wrong. Why? Because the blood had established this covenant, and it had sealed everything that is in it. So you can't add to or take from that particular covenant. That's part of what the blood was indicating. Okay? Now, oh yes, yeah. When we get to the other covenant, it applies to Revelation, does it? 22, 18, and 19. So, Larry.
You know, it's interesting that the medical profession for years thought that demons were in the blood, and the way to cure a disease was to drain the blood.
That's right.
George Washington almost died because of a bloodletting.
Yeah.
But if they had read the Bible, there's the answer right there. The life is in the blood.
Life's in the blood. Yeah, that's one of those scientific evidences in Scripture. That it's not intended to be a scientific evidence, but it is, isn't it? And just very subtle that it's stated. Okay, so he just states the fact that in order for a covenant to be binding, there has to be what? Blood. Okay? There has to be blood. That's the way a covenant is dedicated. He now tells us about Moses dedicating that particular testament. Okay? That's found in verse 19. Notice what he says. For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and of goats with water and scarlet wood and hyssop and sprinkled both the book and what? All the people. Wow. How'd you like to be on the front row of that? You ever gone to SeaWorld? They got what? splash zone. You know, you don't get in splash zone, okay? I guess when you were around Moses, you didn't get in sprinkle zone, okay? That's what transpired. Turn over to Exodus for just a minute. Exodus 24, verse 3. Somebody got it? You can just read it to us. Exodus 24, verse 3. Now notice what it says in Hebrews 9:19. For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats. Now right here in Exodus, what does he just finish doing? He just finished speaking the words of the law to the people. Okay? Now notice what it says beginning at verse 4. And Moses wrote all the words of the law and rose up early in the morning, and builded an altar under a hill, and 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the children of Israel, which offered burnt offerings, and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood, and put it in basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Now drop down to verse 8. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, Behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord hath made with you concerning all these words. Now, here's what's interesting, okay? And you can go home tonight and you can do the comparisons. You compare Exodus 24 with Hebrews 9:19. And guess what you find? You find a lot of things said in one that are not said in the other. And then you turn to Hebrews and you find a lot of things in Hebrews that is not said, guess where? In Exodus. And you're going, wow. Okay? Let me give you some illustrations. Okay? Exodus said that he sprinkled the blood where? Two places. Altar and the people. Do you read of an altar being sprinkled in Hebrews? We didn't read of an altar being sprinkled in Hebrews. Okay? What does Exodus not tell us was sprinkled that Hebrews said was sprinkled? The book of the covenant. Doesn't say that in Exodus. That's interesting, isn't it? Okay? Guys, this is why sometimes we need all of Revelation to give us the entire story and picture of what transpired. Okay? We read in Exodus about basins being used, right? He put half the blood in basins and half the blood he did what? Sprinkled on the people and the altar. We don't read about the blood being put in basins. We just read about it being what? Sprinkled on the book and the people in Hebrews. In Exodus, do you read about water? Do you read about hyssop? Do you read about calves and bulls? I mean, calves and goats. Don't read about that. But you read about oxen in Hebrews, don't you? Okay, now isn't that interesting? Okay. Let me ask you this. Not so much why the difference. Okay, I'm not really concerned about the difference. You put both stories together and you get the full picture of what transpired that day. Okay? So my question is, what's the real significance here? What's in both accounts, what is he really trying to emphasize? Huh? Yeah, folks, B-L-O-O-D, blood. That's what's important. Okay? All the other incidentals, you know, all the other little things that transpired with it, it's not that important, is it? We might go home and we might say something like this. We may go on a mission trip and we might come back and we say, you know what? We baptized 5 people on our mission trip. That's all we say. Then about 3 weeks later, you start talking about the baptism, right? And you start saying, Yeah, we baptized 5 people. We baptized one in a river. We baptized one in an ocean. We baptized one in just an old bathtub. Uh-oh. You didn't say that the first time. Does that really change the story? What's the important part? The baptism, right? The baptism. And you may tell somebody else, well, yeah, and we baptized 3 women and 2 men. Uh-oh. That still adds up to what? 5, it's just additional information. But it's still, what's the important part? The baptism. Okay? And that's what he's trying to emphasize in both texts. The blood is what's important. Okay? And both of them tell us about the blood, don't they? And that the blood was sprinkled. They just don't tell us that it was everything that it was sprinkled on. Just a few of the things that it was sprinkled on. And you put the stories together, and guess what? You get the whole ball of wax. Okay? So just understand that the real important feature is blood. Okay? Now, watch verse 27. Verse 20. This is the affirmation. He says he sprinkled it on what? Sprinkled it on the book. Sprinkled it upon the people. Why both those two things? What does that show? Book and people. Yeah. This is the covenant that is binding upon you, the who? People. And the same blood would bind people and covenant together. Okay? So whatever blood he sprinkled on the book, he sprinkled on the people. And folks, that bound those 2 individuals. The covenant to the people to the covenant. Okay? And then, here's what he says. Not only did he go through the action, there's an affirmation that he makes, and he says this, saying, this is the blood of the testament, which God hath enjoined unto you. Wow. Notice point A. Moses does not just complete the action. He affirmed the very purpose of the action in the ears of the people. Folks, they are fully aware at that point of the meaning of the action. Okay? Fully aware of the meaning of the action. Can you go through an action and somebody not know the meaning? Yeah. Circumcision was that way in the Old Testament, wasn't it? When circumcision was initially carried out, how old was the baby? 8 days old. He had no clue, did he? There was an action going on. He was hollering and screaming. But he had no clue as to why it was being done. You see, it's possible for us to go through an action and not understand what the action's about. Okay? Well, Moses didn't want that going on. So what does he affirm? He immediately affirms what this is. This is what? This is the blood of the testament, which God hath what? Enjoined unto you. Now notice that little word, enjoined. Strong says to enjoin. I hate that. Thayer says to order, command to be done. Vine says it means to charge with in the sense of commanding. Isn't that something? Folks, God can command a covenant upon a group of people. And that's what He did to Israel. And guess what? Israel had no what? They really didn't have a choice in this covenant. God chose them. God formed the covenant. And God commanded them to what? Keep the covenant. He enjoined it upon them. Commanded it upon them. Notice the 2 statements that I have there. One comes from Brother Waycaster. The use of the word commanded or enjoined shows clearly that the law of Moses was not a simple contract or agreement between God and man, as if it were between equals. It was rather a solemn agreement made by God for the people and imposed upon them for their acceptance. Man. What might you be thinking right now?
Superior and inferior relationship.
Okay? But what else might you be thinking? That ain't fair. Right? That's not fair. Here God comes down, grabs these people out of all the rest of the world, and just what? Forces a covenant on them. And that's exactly what happened. Isn't that interesting? That's what you think of. But it's not all covenants. Okay? Not all covenants. Okay? So how do you overcome this concept that God enjoined this covenant on these people? Look at what Barnes says. Let's just read what he says real quick. It is a solemn arrangement on the part of God, which He proposes to mankind and which He enjoins them to embrace, which they are not indeed at liberty to disregard. That's the force of the word enjoin, folks. Okay. Now, yes, they do have freedom of choice, don't they? I mean, they can disregard the covenant, and guess what? They will. Okay. They do, don't they? But it just doesn't seem fair that God would come down and choose this particular group of people and just enjoin His covenant on them. That's not fair. So what do you say to that? How?
Well, since God is the creator, He created the earth with His rules.
There's the first point. God is what? Folks, God is sovereign. What does that word mean? Sovereign. He is over all. He has all authority over all. And guess what? You and I, as little piddly man, regardless of how great we think we are, have no right to question God. You don't have that right. Okay? Now you can, and God says what? Where is the scribe? Where is the wise? Where is the disputer of this world? Come on, you little smart little people. Yeah, Job wanted to talk to him, didn't he? Job was a wise man. By the time he got through, he humiliated Job, did he not? I'm sorry, God. Man doesn't have a right to say what God can and cannot do. He's who? He's God. Jim, what were you going to say? Yes. That's the second element of this, isn't it? Folks, God's not a mean God. God is a good God. And so when God comes to you and He gives you a covenant, it's not for your worse, it's for your better. Israel was being lifted out of the world, wasn't she? And she was being made better before the entirety of the world, or at least she should have been, right? Had she followed the dictates of God, she would have been a righteous nation, whereas if you look at all the ones around them, they were evil and wicked and morally corrupt. They were horrible, weren't they? Okay? June? Similar? Sure is. You know, I've got control here, right? And that's what you tell your kids sometime, right? You don't have a say. You know, well, that ain't fair. Who asked you about the fair? Fair comes to Jacksonville once a year. You can go down there then. You know?
Society wants to question God. You know, they want to do away with God. They think that He's not correct and we're smarter than Him, and so they come up with all these theories, evolution and all that kind of stuff. And you know, especially in the school system.
That's everywhere. Everywhere, you're right. And but you know, guys, it wasn't unfair. Okay, in fact, it was almost being too fair, wasn't it? You know, and did Moses? I mean, did Israel ultimately relish this relationship with God? Too much, didn't they? To the point that they became proud and arrogant. We be the children of Abraham. Unto us was given the law and the commandments, you know, and they lifted themselves up with arrogancy over the rest of the world, didn't they? And that's why you had such a harsh relationship between Jew and Gentile. And so they eventually got it that this is a good covenant, but They wanted the elevation, but they didn't want the what? The obligation that comes with that. That's exactly right. And are we that way sometime? Nah? Okay. Carol's never that way. The rest of us are, but I'm just being mean.
This verse 20 is almost identical to the one in Matthew 26:28.
Okay, read it.
1:28 says, "For this is my blood of the new covenant."
Absolutely. See, right now he's talking about what? Old Testament. Now I said in this section he's going to be comparing and contrasting. And we're going to come to that in just a minute. But folks, guess what? The New Testament was what? Dedicated with blood. And he'll eventually get to that. See, he's stealing my thunder. He got up here and read my notes and stuff. I'm just kidding with him too. Now watch this next statement. He talks about the articles that were sprinkled. Okay? Moreover, he sprinkled likewise with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry, and watch this, almost all things are by the law purged with blood. Wow. Okay, now we only read in we only read in Exodus what? What did he sprinkle? The altar and the people. Now what have we learned that he also sprinkled? The tabernacle, the vessels of the tabernacle, the book of the covenant, okay? And then he also just goes on and makes an even broader statement. Almost all things are what? Purged with blood. Isn't that something? Purged. Guys, look down there. I've given you some other things that were sprinkled as well. Aaron and his sons and their garments, Exodus 29. The altar, Leviticus 1, 5 through 11. The veil of the sanctuary, that's found over in Leviticus 4, 16 and 17. There were a lot of things purged with what? Purged with blood. Now, that means that we need to look at the act that was performed. Purged with blood. What does that little word purged mean? Strong says to cleanse. Thayer says to make clean, cleanse, remove from stain and dirt, to purify from wickedness. Vine says to make, it says should be clean, cleanse, to make free from the stain and guilt of sin. Okay, now I just want you to stop a minute and think. Okay? Not only is this blood to dedicate the covenant, but it is also being used to do what? Cleanse everything. Okay? Cleanse everything. To purge everything. To make it what? Holy, consecrated, pure in whose sight? In the sight of God. Now watch point 2 there. Everything involved in the salvation of man must first be made pure before it can be what? Of benefit to our salvation. Okay? Isn't that something? Everything under the old covenant was carnal. True or false? What do I mean by that, carnal? Fleshly, physical, tangible. You could walk up and touch the what? The book. You could walk up and touch Aaron and his sons. You could walk up and touch the altar, couldn't you? You could literally, if you were a priest, go in and out of the tabernacle, couldn't you? It could literally be seen, but everything was physical, wasn't it? Everything was carnal. So before God would allow those things in His use, what did He do to them? Sprinkled them with blood to make them what? Pure and holy. Wow. Have you ever really thought about that? Being done and the reason it was done in the Old Testament? Okay? Guys, here you go. You walk around the tabernacle. What do you see on it? Bloodstains. If you went in and you see the veil that separated the holy from the most holy place, what did you see? Saw bloodstains. Okay, you looked at the book, you saw bloodstains. You look at Aaron's garb that he wore, guess what you saw? Bloodstains. Everywhere you looked, what did you see? You saw blood to remind you what? God has cleansed all of this for His purpose. And guys, unless God had cleansed it, it could not be what? It could not be used. I want you to state that in your... If you don't learn anything else in this lesson tonight, you better walk out that door and learn this one. Until God cleanses it, it cannot be what? Can't be used. Got that? Just keep it in your brain. All right? Now notice this. The aim. And without shedding of blood is no what? No remission. Uh-oh. That goes all the way back to that thought that we had from Leviticus 17:11, that the life of the flesh is where? In the blood. Okay? Follow the thoughts as we go through this, okay? Noted earlier, the life is in the blood, Leviticus 17:11. There were some things cleansed by water. I'd have to go back and do some research. There were some things cleansed even by fire. Okay, there were a few items, that were kind of incidental type stuff that weren't included in it. Okay.
I remember there was a heifer burned out and took the ashes from it.
Yep. Yep, that would be on the Day of Atonement. But get the thought process, okay? He said, now remember, he says, without the shedding of blood. This is the first time he's mentioned the shedding of blood in what? Remission of sins. So far, all he's talked about is the dedication with blood, right? Now he connects it to remission of sin. Folks, even under the Old Testament, in the mind of God was what? The remission of sins. Okay? Because man is what? Man is sinful, isn't he? And guess what it's going to take to cleanse him? Blood. Blood. Why? Well, sin involves the breaking of God's law. 1 John 3:4. Folks, the minute you and I break God's law, guess what the sentence is that rests upon us? Death. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. Ezekiel 18:20. Well, guys, how do you die? The life of the flesh is what? In the blood. In order to pay the penalty for sin, death, there has to be the what? The shedding of blood. See the connection? That's the reason he tells us where the life is in the blood. Death, when blood is shed, life is given, death occurs, and sin's penalty is what? Paid. Everything. Death is essential to the forgiveness of sins. Folks, in order for sin to be forgiven, something has to what? Die. That's God's law. Okay? Now, if you want to know why, if you want to try to reason about it, then you just die, go ask God about it. Okay, why did you do this, God? Okay? All I know is this is the law, isn't it? Now notice that next statement. Everything in God's plan of redemption is involved in the forgiveness of man's sins. The sprinkling of the blood reminded Israel that a price was paid for them to have a relationship with God. Wow. Almost everywhere they looked in their major, in the major components of Judaism, they saw what? Blood. Not just the sacrifices, and guess what? Tons and tons of blood was shed in those sacrifices too. But guys, anything they saw connected to Judaism that was a major component, the priesthood, the tabernacle, the altar, the book, everything had what on it? Blood. Guys, the only way that you and I have a relationship with God is through the blood. Wow. It's pretty powerful stuff, isn't it? Now, that leads us to Hebrews 9:23. And guys, right here is where it gets personal. Okay? This is where it gets personal for us. The Old Testament, we look at that, oh, that's pretty cool. We learn a few things. We say, wow, that's pretty sharp. But guess what? It all comes back to who? To us. The facsimile, compared and contrasted. It was therefore necessary that the patterns of the things in the heavens be purified with these. Did y'all get what he just said? He just said that everything in the Old Testament are patterns of things in the heavens. He said it was necessary that those things under the old law, the altar, the book of the covenant, the tabernacle, all those things under the old testament, it was necessary that those patterns of things in the heaven be what? Be purified with this. What is it? With the blood of bulls and goats. Okay? He said it was necessary. Now listen to what he says. But the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. You see, he's making a comparison. He said that everything under the Old Testament had to be what? Purified. And he says the things in the New Testament, the heavenly things, have to be what? Purified. But the things under the New Testament have to be purified with what? Better sacrifices than those old sacrifices of animals in the Old Testament. It's pretty powerful. Pretty powerful. The Old Testament contained the patterns of things in the heavens. Strong says an exhibit for imitation, a representation, a figure, a copy, an example, an imitation. A figure, Vine says, an example for imitation. Folks, everything you see in the Old Testament is a figure, is an example, is a pattern of what? Something that was in the what? In the heavens. They're also called types, shadows, examples. Okay? You see, God was preparing the nation of Israel for what? The New Testament. Okay? And here's what's interesting. All of these things that were patterns in the Old Testament already existed where? In the heavens. And where were they? In the mind of God, weren't they? Now, here's the kicker, okay? There's a contrast that we need to talk about, okay? The blood of calves and goats purified the patterns, right? Okay? The sprinkling of the blood that Moses did, that purified the tabernacle, purified the altar, purified the book, all those things. But he says, the things in the heavens have to be what? Purified with better sacrifices. Uh-oh. That's a toughie. The things in the heavens have to be what? Purified. The things in the heavens have to be purified. Are you getting this? I understand that the stuff that was earthly, that was carnal, had to be what? Purified. But now he says, in like manner, the heavenly things need to be what? Purified. With what? Better sacrifices. Better sacrifices. Who is that? That's Jesus, folks. Okay? The things in the New Testament haven't been purified with the blood of bulls and goats. They've been purified with what? The blood of Christ. And he's going to enter into the next section. Now that he's mentioned that sacrifice, he's going to spend the rest of the time, 24 through 28, talking about the sacrifice, because that's where his mind is now. He's going to be comparing and contrasting that sacrifice with that under the old law. But he says this sacrifice is needed to do what? Purify the heavenly things. Oh man, that doesn't even make sense. If they're heavenly, why do they need what? purification? Well, I want you to think about it, folks. The new law that would save man from sin had to be sealed, didn't it? So guess what it had to have? Blood. In order to seal it, right? Two things. In order to make it operative and in order to seal it, there had to be what? Blood. That's why Jesus said, This is the blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. My blood is going to establish and seal the New Testament. Guess what you can't do with the New Testament? Add to or take from. Okay? That's why we don't need another testament from the Mormon Church. I got everything I need in this testament. You know that? Once Jesus died and sealed this book, folks, there is no other book. The Quran is not any inspired book of God. This is all we need. This book was sealed by the blood of Jesus. I don't need anything else. Okay? But that blood, real quickly, that blood cleansed the heavenly things. Folks, I want you to think spiritually now. What is the tabernacle of God? What is the temple of God? It's the church. The church is the who? The church is the people. In order for us to become part of the heavenly things, what do we have to be? We have to be purged. We have to be cleansed. You see, we're part of the heavenly things. We're part of the tabernacle of God. The tabernacle not made with hands. But before I can become a part of that heavenly thing, I had to be what? Purged. With what? Not blood of bulls and goats, but better sacrifices. The sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Guys, are we part of a priesthood? Yeah, we're priests, aren't we? Part of the Melchizedekian priesthood after the order of Jesus Christ, aren't we? Well, guys, under the Old Covenant, guess what had to be sprinkled with blood? Aaron and his sons. But in order for me to be a priest, you see, I'm a sinner. In order for me to be a priest in the house of God, what do I have to be? I got to be purged. I got to be cleansed. You see, it was necessary that not only the patterns be cleansed, but also what? The heavenly things are cleansed. Now here's what I want you to leave with. You and I, because we've been immersed into Christ for the remission of our sins, are part of the heavenly things. Got that? You're a heavenly thing. That's pretty good, isn't it? If that doesn't make you excited, I can't get you that way. Okay? Good stuff right there, guys.